In this episode of the Encounter Report, 4 of SKA's best friends confront Francois in Clair Obscur Expedition 33. There's Axelrod, your humble narrator who did a blind playthrough, Mr. JRPG who did a semi-blind playthrough, Arrow Mio who did a blind playthrough, and DigD who did a semi-blind playthrough. Each of us played on the Expeditioner difficulty as well as on PC, with the exception of Mr. JRPG who played on the PlayStation 5. And with all that out of the way, it's time to reclaim some rocks from our Mon Ami. First up are battle types, and this is where we have our first deviations. While each of us spent the most time in random encounters, there's variation among us. I have 25 more random encounters than DigD, but he spent more than 2 hours in random encounters than I did. Meanwhile, Mr. JRPG has the most random encounters and the most time spent in random encounters, while Arrow Mio has the least amount of encounters and spent more time in random encounters than I did. The boss numbers also elicit some curiosities. I have a significantly lower amount of time spent on bosses, as well as the least number of boss encounters. Mr. JRPG once again sports the highest and narrowly misses out on the most time spent on those boss encounters. For both Arrow Mio and DigD, they sit in a similar ballpark to each other, but their total death percent shows that Arrow Mio's deaths were more impactful on boss encounters than DigD. For the remaining battle types, we can see the true challenges everyone faced. For clarity, optional encounters typically consisted of fighting gestural shops, doing arena fights, endless tower encounters, or otherwise fights that don't fit into other categories. With the exception of Mr. JRPG, who did the endless tower, which accounts for 2 hours 46 minutes of his optional encounter time, these encounters weren't as impactful for us despite the amount of deaths. Special encounters are typically mini-boss style encounters. Nearly all of these fights would have an enemy with a boss health bar or otherwise be a greater than normal challenge. These can include Sprong in the ocean, Scavenger from the Falling Leaves zone, or Mimes. These encounters generally took a large toll on everyone, sporting high encounter times and multiple deaths. Chromatic fights were exactly those, chromatic Nevrons excluding the ones in Endless Tower. These would consistently be some of the more challenging fights everyone did, partly due to pressing our luck. Each of us had at least 50% of our total chromatic encounters as deaths, and they still make up a significant chunk of total deaths each of us had as well. Battle locations is next, and here we can see the spread of where encounters took place. Consistent amongst all of us were the low amount of world map encounters in comparison to dungeon encounters. For Mr. JRPG, Arrow Mio, and DigD, they all spent 30% or more of their stream in dungeon encounters. For combat types, we can see the distribution of how each encounter ended. Fight encounters end normally, while issue encounters end prematurely. For Arrow Mio and myself, ours were crashes in combat, while Mr. JRPG chose to exit out of the game mid-battle so that team adjustments could be made. What's extremely notable is that the deaths displayed here are the highest we've ever had in an encounter report up to this point. The most deaths anyone has ever had was 41 for an individual person, and the most combined deaths for all participants was 89. Both DigD and myself set a new record for individual deaths, while Mr. JRPG not only beats that, but also beats the combined total with just his deaths alone. If there was one takeaway here, it's that Clair Obscur Expedition 33 is a deadly game. Except for Arrow Mio, he's basically untouchable. Following that up are subtypes, where we can check out some of the extra stuff that everyone's been doing. In this case, everyone partook in at least a little bit of grinding. However, everyone but myself also did some battles off-screen that aren't included in these numbers. Both Mr. JRPG and DigD had the greatest impact of that off-screen grinding, but Mr. JRPG had his sights set on Simon, so those numbers needed to go up. For first strikes, these are the number of encounters where each person entered the fight with an advantage. These surprisingly took up a very significant portion of encounter percent, where everyone was at 50% or higher excluding Mr. JRPG. If you only count battles that are eligible for first strikes, then I sit at 94% of encounters entered with first strike, Mr. JRPG at 64%, Arrow Mio at 91%, and DigD at 78%. Next up is the boss encounter time graph. On the left, we have the time, and on the bottom, each boss in the game. Each boss takes up a rectangle, and within those rectangles, the length of time it took each person to defeat the boss on their most recent kill attempt. Here, we can see that each of us had very similar struggles for many of the early game bosses. Encounters like Lampmaster have cutscenes in the middle of the fight, so I opted to split those fights if the cutscene was over a certain length. And for Lampmaster specifically, that was the end of Act 1, and despite Mr. JRPG's Goblu kill, which was extraordinarily fast, all of us were about the same or had a buddy pretty close. This continues into Act 2, where everyone is pretty close to one another in some way. Some outliers include Aramio on Renoir 1 or Dig D on the Paintress Phase 2, but fairly consistent. For myself, I happened to stumble upon a pretty viable strategy early on, which allowed me to deviate from the pack and gain some low boss kill times. And by the time Act 3 rolls around, I'm beyond overpowered and Mr. JRPG is extremely high level in addition to being overpowered, which accounts for our much lower times. We've also got the level progression graph for each person. On the left, we have the levels, and on the bottom, many of the bosses in the game. Each boss takes up a rectangle in the graph, and within those rectangles, we have the highest level in the party for each participant when that boss was defeated. Here we can see the game has a pretty consistent ramp up across the journey, and there's very little deviation from that. The small exception is that the Visages and Mask Keeper fights, as well as the Siren fight. These can be done in any order, but as alluded in-game, Siren is supposed to be the easier of the two. Coincidentally, I was the only person to fight Siren second, and Mr. JRPG was the only person to fight Visages and Mask Keeper before doing the optional Mask Wings of the dungeon. And that segues us into party composition. Characters who made up the final party have a faint gray highlight to them, as there were only 3 party members allowed in fights. And we may as well start with the deadly elephant in the room, that being character deaths. Since tracking them, the highest amount of character deaths any one person got was 265, and as you can see, most of us got that beat. In fact, Mr. JRPG almost has it beat with just 1 character. Sidestepping that, everyone's choice of character and how they utilized them was actually quite fascinating. For myself, Lune was my primary damage dealer, with CL being a secondary damage dealer with buff capabilities, and Monoko just being a high defense tank to revive my glass cannons. Mr. JRPG had Verso as his primary damage dealer, CL offering support and secondary damage, and Monoko being a jack of all trades. For Aramio, Lune was support-oriented with damage capabilities, and Mael filled the damage role with Monoko being a main damage dealer as well. For Dig D, Lune was primarily support with Mael and CL being the bulk of his damage. However, Dig D also cycled in party members quite a bit, which mostly explains why his levels are far closer together. It's also noteworthy that despite everyone being on the same difficulty, I was the only person to be primarily parry-oriented. For whatever reason, I found dodging to be significantly more challenging than parrying, while everyone else had the opposite feeling. Dig D was the most hybrid out of everyone else, but still leaned more into dodging. We've also got chapter data to show how many encounters occurred in each act. For most of us, Act 2 contained the bulk of our encounters and time spent in encounters. However, everyone also tasted some Act 3. Dig D explored several areas, but mostly stayed away from the optional locations. Aramio did 2 fights before moving on to the final dungeon. I visited every location except Renoir's drafts, and Mr. JRPG went everywhere and did everything. We're making a quick stop at number of enemies to show how many encounters had what number of enemies in them. I'm actually the odd one out here, where I don't have an almost equally high 3 enemy encounter time. What is interesting though, is that everyone consistently had lower average times for 3 enemy encounters than 1 enemy. Granted, every boss fight was a single enemy encounter, so that's the biggest contributor there. And to close everything out, here's the final combined stats. It truly is fascinating to see how deadly this game can be and just how much challenge that there is available. Between all of us, we had 1,643 character deaths, and I feel confident in saying that number won't be beat anytime soon, if ever. And that's the Clair Obscur Expedition 33 Encounter Report. I hope you visit everyone's channels and social media to praise them for all this wonderful data. With another report done, I'm sure Francois will let us borrow his new rock.
Over my dead body! Rah!
Thanks for watching, appreciate it, see you on the next video.